Shana Tova. You're welcome to set your prayer books, your machzorim down for just a few moments. So, I didn't know it then, but that day, 3 years ago, at Gavi's birthday party, was going to be one of the most transformative times of turning, of tshuva in my life. I really have become a different person now. Rambam, the great Jewish philosopher from 1,000 years ago, teaches that it's only true tshuva, it's only real change, if when we're put in the same situation another time, we act differently. And I do act differently now. But was it so awkward then. Let me set the scene a little bit. It was 2015, Gavi was turning 4, and everyone was descending on our house in Peoria. My parents from Memphis, my in-laws from St. Louis, cousins, friends, congregants, party planning and cleaning. It was the usual craziness of family celebrations when everyone lives out of town. I remember walking downstairs the morning of the party. I remember just being so frustrated. I had done everything so that everyone else would be happy, all of the details and the planning and the coordinating. And yet, no one was happy with me. Not my parents, not my in-laws, not Daniel. Even Gavi, the birthday boy, was screaming. And all I had tried to do was make everyone else happy. So there's a story in the Talmud, in the huge compendium of Jewish knowledge that the rabbis call the Oral Torah. There's a story in there that I just can't get out of my head. It tells of 2 very different rabbis. We have Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabban Gamliel. Rabbi Joshua, Yehoshua, is a kind, empathetic hero in the Talmud. And then there's Rabban Gamliel, technically Rabban Gamliel II, who is the stern, conservative head of the academy, and arguably the most important rabbi and Jewish leader of his time. Now, this is all taking place in the aftermath of the annihilation of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, a time when the rabbis of the academy are a small, fragmented group trying to survive. As head of the academy, Gamliel famously believed that in order for the Jewish people to carry on, there needed to be strict adherence to a single understanding of Jewish law and a limit on dissenting voices. So when a student comes and asks both rabbis the same Jewish legal question, is praying the evening service optional or obligatory, and the 2 rabbis answer differently, you know there's going to be trouble. The first we hear of it is when the student asks Rabbi Joshua, who lives a life barely above the poverty level, working as a blacksmith. It's easy to imagine Rabbi Joshua thinking back to all the evenings he has come home exhausted, too tired for yet one more obligation. And so he answers the student's question leniently, saying that the evening prayers are optional. But the student evidently isn't satisfied with this answer. Maybe they want a different opinion. Maybe they're just trying to stir up trouble. Anyhow, the student goes to Rabban Gamliel, who is famously stringent on questions such as this. It's easy to imagine here, too, that Rabban Gamliel's life is impacting his answer. He's a wealthy person, the son of a famous family, who could dedicate his life to study and to the academy at Yavna. We can envision why a life like this would lead him to think that more obligation, greater stringencies, are needed. And so, of course, when the student asks him if the evening prayers are optional or obligatory, he answers that they are obligatory. When Gamliel hears that Joshua has answered the question differently, that this public legal ruling conflicts with his own, Gamliel openly shames and embarrasses Joshua before the entire academy for hours and hours and hours. This goes on for so long that Gamliel starts teaching other subjects, with Joshua standing next to him on display. The other students in the academy grow more and more uncomfortable with what's happening in front of them. They eventually become so disturbed with Gamliel's behavior that they rise up against him and demand he be removed as head of the academy. Along with his forced departure comes an opportunity, a hope. The real change can finally come for the Institute. The Talmud says that Gamliel had locked the gates of the academy and famously would only allow the elite to study there. And so, with the new head of Yavne, the bars are removed and the guards stand down from their posts at the door, letting in anyone who wants to study. Immediately, we're told they have to add as many as 700 rows of seats to accommodate the overwhelming number of students who want to study Torah there now. I can't stop thinking about what that must have been like for Gamliel. He's not a bad guy, really. He's just obtuse and sheltered within his own worldview. In the story in the Talmud, it's striking how clear Gamliel's failures of leadership are made to him. We are told that even after he was removed from his position, he still continued to show up at the academy, that in fact he never missed a single moment. And so he watched firsthand as these changes took place and were embraced by the other rabbis and the community at large. He watched as more and more students streamed in the doors of Yavne, and he watched as the boundaries that he believed were essential to survival were shown to be obsolete, and a fresh vision, one that was clearly already more successful, took its place. And so, having lost his position and having painfully witnessed just how effective things could be when he was removed from leadership, Rabbi Gamliel engages in a painful but brutally honest moment of tshuva that ultimately leads him to Joshua's door to apologize. Tshuva is very rarely a revolution. When we do it right, it's small changes, small turnings, that over time lead our lives in a totally different direction. We see this dynamic at play when Gamliel shows up at Rabbi Joshua's house and becomes tongue-tied upon discovering that the walls themselves are covered in thick layers of black soot. Even though they have studied at the same place for years, Gamliel doesn't really know Joshua. He doesn't understand the poverty of most of the rabbis who don't come from wealthy, noble families like his own. And he's speechless when he realizes how arduous Joshua's life must be as a blacksmith and recognizes just how out of touch he is with his own community. Rabban Gamliel stammers out what feels like an incomplete apology, which Joshua promptly ignores, until Gamliel ultimately resorts to reminding Joshua of the relationship he had with his father, and Joshua finally forgives him. When we hear a story like this one, with Joshua and Gamliel, with two main characters, isn't it amazing how quickly we identify with the hero, in this case with Joshua? There's something so very human about this, how we almost always see ourselves as the hero of our own story, and how we almost always imagine ourselves as the good person in the stories we hear. We see ourselves as the protagonist, the one with agency, the one that is acting in the world. It's certainly how I felt the first 6 or so times I read this story. I found it so incredibly frustrating. It feels like we were so close to fixing the problems. Why then does Joshua give in and forgive Gamliel, which lets Gamliel once again be reinstated as head of the academy? Just like that, just when it felt like real change was here, the old boss is back in power. I don't know about y'all, but particularly in this last year, when it has seemed like there is something else crazy and mind-boggling in the news weekly, almost daily, it's easy to lose track of some of the stories that are happening on the other side of the world. But some of us might recall that this past January, the Polish Parliament's lower house approved a controversial bill that forbids any mention of participation of the Polish nation in crimes committed during the Holocaust. Now, this new Polish law, anyone who violates the legislation, whether they are Polish citizens or not, faces a fine or imprisonment of up to 3 years. Think about that for a moment. Theoretically, a March of the Living tour guide leading American Jewish kids through Poland is forbidden from talking about how willingly average Poles participated in the Shoah. But perhaps even more perniciously, this law means that the story that future generations of Poles will tell themselves about their history is profoundly a lie. They will never have a chance to learn from their own history. They will instead be told a story where the Poles were the good ones, one of the many victims of the Nazis, rather than the truth. The Poles were often willing and eager co-conspirators in the murder of their Jewish neighbors. We unfortunately find the same sentiment in Austria and Hungary and throughout so much of Europe. The total erasure of responsibility for the Holocaust, with the blame instead placed squarely on the Nazi Germans. But what makes this historical erasure easier is that, unlike their neighbors, for much of the last 2 generations, the Germans have been engaged in a display of public responsibility for their crimes that has little precedent in human history. One of the most striking things about visiting Germany today is that there are remembrances everywhere. There's a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, right next to the heart of the tourist and financial district of the city, next to the Brandenburg Gate, that takes up a whole city block. It's hard to imagine, but it would be something like if St. Louis turned the entire block adjacent to the arch into a memorial to the native peoples that were ethnically cleansed from this land, and to the slaves whose lives and labors were brutally stolen and used as bricks in the construction of our city, our state, and our country. Unlike American kids in the South who take romanticized field trips to beautifully maintained plantations with often only a passing mention of slavery, school children in Germany take brutally honest class trips to concentration camps so that every German child can see up close the evil that was done by their country, often by their grandparents and great-grandparents. Perhaps most striking, though, are the plaques which are placed on the cobblestone sidewalks all over Germany, telling the stories and marking the places of employment or the homes of those murdered. They are called stumbling stones in German because wherever you go, you can't avoid stumbling upon them. It means that when you're in line to get a coffee or running late to catch the subway, you can't help but be reminded of the Shoah, of Germany's national shame. Okay, back to the Talmud for a moment, to our story about Gamliel and Joshua. So a quick reminder, Gamliel has been restored to being the head of the academy after having been, temporarily as it turns out, removed after his repeated offenses. When we look at it as a whole, it's such an infuriating story. After Gamliel was deposed, there was finally change happening at Yavneh. We see the good that immediately comes from him being removed from his post. What exactly are we supposed to get out of this story? The change is slow and plodding and often unfulfilling? I just have to open a newspaper to see that. And then it hit me. This isn't supposed to be about the academy. It's not about how the problems there were fixed. It's a story about Gamliel. It's a story about how an imperfect person who makes genuine tshuva and then becomes a slightly better version of themselves because of it. I had so much identified with Joshua, with the person who reads like a hero, that I had missed the whole point of the story. It's about tshuva. It's about Gamliel's tshuva. Because that's really how it all begins, how the whole improvement of the self-cheshbon hanefesh process works, isn't it? We have to see ourselves not as Joshua, not as the hero of the story, but as Gamliel. Gamliel is a broken and perfect character who becomes all too painfully made aware of his own failings when he loses his job and watches as the academy booms without him. But he stays, and he sees, and he grows. And the academy isn't made perfect, but it is made a little bit better, just as Gamliel isn't made perfect, but he is made a little better. Tshuva in the real world is an evolution that turns the dial just a little bit. And it's an evolution that fundamentally happens not outside of us, but within each and every human being. I can't stop thinking about what it would mean for our world if we all could imagine ourselves a little more as Gamliel in the stories we tell about ourselves. What would it mean for our country if white Americans learned to see themselves, ourselves, not as the Joshua in the story of America, not the hero, but instead as the Gamliel, as the one deeply in need of a moral reckoning with our power, our privilege, and the institutional racism that lies at the heart of our nation? What would it mean for Jewish Americans If we were to think of ourselves not as Joshua when it comes to our relationship with Israel, but in fact as Gamliel, needing to do tshuva for our own unwillingness to take moral responsibility for our power. And what would it mean for each of us, each and every one of us, to view ourselves as Gamliel and not as Joshua, open to the possibility that growth and change and healing are possible? I started today by talking about Gavi's birthday party, a moment that at the time was one of the most exquisitely awkward situations I could imagine. But looking back, years later, I view it as one of those turning points in my life, because that's the moment that I finally got it. I was sitting there, so frustrated that everyone was angry with me, when I had tried to do nothing but please everyone. I finally realized that I wasn't the hero. I was the problem. I was the one that had created this mess. I was the one that needed to change, not those around me. It seems so simple, but it really was one of the most profound moments of tshuva I've ever had. Even though it took years, I'm not the same person anymore. I don't do that anymore. I don't tell people that I love the words that I know they want to hear, even if they aren't quite true. I had a lot of growing to do. We all want to be Joshua in our story, but it's only when we can see ourselves as Gamliel, an imperfect character open to the possibility of growth, that we can begin the process of tshuva. And so this is my blessing for us and my prayer for this coming year of 5779. May we do the work of these days of awe, these days of introspection and reflection and self-growth. And may we open our eyes to those places where we are Gamliel, where we have power and privilege and responsibility. May we engage in the difficult work of tshuva, and may we find the strength to turn the dial just a little bit in our own lives and in our world. Shana Tova Umetuka. May we all be inscribed for blessing and sweetness in this year of 5779.